Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Mira Pantic. Welcome to the Global Newsroom. I hope you're having a good week. This semester, we talked about journalism perform in the Global North and Global South, or how journalists who live in developed countries such as the United States, Canada, European countries, what kind of challenges do they deal with? How do they perform their daily routines versus underdeveloped countries or countries in development that struggle with freedom of expression, where journalists are exposed to dangerous situations when they report on important topics and issues, including organized crime, corruption, gang violence, health-related concerns, and so on. So we talked about journalism in India, in China, in the United States, in European countries, in Africa, in the Middle East, and so on. Today, we are going to talk about something different but still important to understand the global news environment and to understand what are some of the elements of information dissemination across the globe that do not always and necessarily rely on journalism. And in some other areas, you will see how they rely on journalism and what is the role of journalism in this process. So let me share my screen with you. And what we are going to talk about today is public diplomacy and propaganda. So for the beginning of this lecture, I would like you to simply think about this question. What is public diplomacy? What do you think is public diplomacy? You're probably familiar with the term diplomacy, but public diplomacy is a little bit different from that. It is a mechanism that governments across the globe use to influence the opinions of foreigners abroad and within the country. So the heart of public diplomacy is to disseminate information that will target the public in another country abroad, or that will target foreign citizens or different cultural groups within the country. Competitive nations, and among these competitive nations is the United States of America. They rely on public diplomacy to achieve their foreign policy goals. Public diplomacy is not the same as traditional diplomacy, but it is an extension of it. So it goes beyond officials, because public diplomacy is predominantly focused on a wider population in another country, not on its country's officials, which is the case with traditional diplomacy. So public diplomacy is this tool that sovereign states use to win the affection of the foreign public by making them embrace their values and policies. For the United States, the public diplomacy goal is to win affection of the foreign public because they want them to embrace the values and foreign policy goals of the United States. Now, what is the difference between traditional versus public diplomacy? Traditional diplomacy is focused primarily on government-to-government organizations. So when we talk about traditional diplomacy, we talked about elites, this communication that happens between elites, between two governments, between their top representatives. But on the other hand, the center of attention of public diplomacy is the wider population. So what public diplomacy targets are not only elites. So it doesn't mean that the public diplomacy does not target elites. It does target elites as well. But aside from the elites, which is the focus of traditional diplomacy, public diplomacy also targets various groups and communities in other countries and cultures. What are some examples of these groups? So such groups include, but they're not limited to, NGOs or non-governmental organizations, think tanks, corporations, as well as local communities such as religious groups, human rights advocates, opinion leaders, individual citizens, and broad masses. It also targets journalists. So I will give you an example. When I worked as a journalist in Serbia in 2009, the US government had this program for journalistic professional development in the United States. What did it mean? It meant that we would apply for the program and that they would select several journalists, and I was among those journalists selected. They sent us to diverse universities in the United States where we learned about their culture, the US culture. We learned about the educational system. I was specifically a visiting scholar or a visiting journalist at Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois. So that is the place where I attended classes, and that's the place where I got exposed to the American educational system for the first time and to the American culture directly. So I traveled across the US. I learned a lot about the country. So the entire goal of that program, and it really does represent public diplomacy efforts of the United States. So the goal of the program is for us journalists to be exposed to American culture and values and their educational system. And then when we go back to our country, we can, as journalists, produce information that will raise awareness of American society. So that is just an example that I wanted to share with you because I like this topic, especially because I was actually part of, I actually, in a way, participated in the US public diplomacy efforts. So let's take a look at how traditional versus public diplomacy work. So as you can see, when it comes to traditional diplomacy, we have this government-to-government communication, so it's pretty linear. And then with public diplomacy, there is this government to the public communication. So public diplomacy can also be non-governmental. So aside from, like, an example, public diplomacy could also be when other countries and cultures adopt values from Hollywood movies. So all these tiny elements where values and goals and certain costumes from one country are being transferred to another one represent public diplomacy in a way. So you can see how it works. It's basically the primarily focus of public diplomacy is government to people communication. Let's take a look at the roots of public diplomacy and how it all started. What were the goals of public diplomacy? So the roots of public diplomacy date back to the end of the 19th century. And it didn't start with the United States, but it actually started with France, when France established the Alliance Française to promote its language and literature. And they also wanted to gain back the reputation, which was worsened after France lost Franco-Prussian War. So, but it started with France, but then other countries decided to adopt what France has developed. So the US, for instance, started pursuing its public diplomacy during the World War I. During that time, President Woodrow Wilson established the office, which included government-run news service to inform and educate foreign audiences about the US. So what does it mean, basically? It means you're producing information, and that information is supposed to be favorable of the US government, US culture, US society. And then you share that information to foreign audiences. And you can see here how the US is basically one of the leaders in public diplomacy, because to be successful in creating and implementing public diplomacy goals, you really need to have a lot of tools to influence other people's opinions. So not just that the US is economically strong, so they can sponsor all these programs, including the program that allow me to come to the United States and spend a school year at Bradley University in Peoria, but also many others through which they can spread favorable images to other countries and the people who live there. Public diplomacy of the country has further developed during the World War II and especially during the Cold War, when we had two blocks, Eastern and Western blocks. So for the Western bloc, it was particularly important to win affection of the public in other countries for their goals during the Cold War, to be on their side. So what is the difference? What is this policy of sticks and carrots? Maybe you have heard of that term before, but there are multiple ways. How do we have an impact on others' behavior in democracy? According to Joseph Nye, and he is one of the greatest contributor to theory of public diplomacy, he distinguished three different ways to impact others' behavior in diplomacy. One of them is the policy of sticks, which refers to indulging in threats to force a country to act in a certain way. Let's take a look at some of these examples. So for instance, when Russian invasion on Ukraine started, Western countries, including the United States, imposed sanctions on Russia because they wanted Russia to stop this war in Ukraine. It didn't work, but it didn't work in terms of Russia continued the war. But the thing is that it really weakened the economy of Russia. So the sanctions actually had a great impact on Russia. The policy of carrots, so sticks and carrots, it refers to some specific rewards that a country gets if it acts in certain ways. So I'll give you an example. My country, Serbia, is a candidate for the EU membership, European Union membership. So the EU has this sticks and carrots policy for Serbia. So they require Serbia to fulfill certain goals, political, such as, oh, these are the requirements that you need to meet in order to move forward in the EU integration process. So, or there will be certain requirements for the country in order to receive foreign aid. And if they fulfill these requirements, so it is the policy of sticks. So you need to do this in order to gain some benefit. So that is basically the policy of sticks and carrots, and it is predominantly utilized, employed by the United States, European countries, and other developed countries in the world. But this is the policy of sticks and carrots is actually native to the traditional diplomacy, but public diplomacy is a bit different, and we also call it the soft power. So there is no this policy of sticks and carrots, but we call it the soft power because it arises from the government's mobilization of various resources aimed at winning the affection of foreign audiences. So what are some of these resources that are being used as part of the soft power? They include cultural values, political values, and foreign policy. Public diplomacy basically employs soft power to develop long-term relationships with other countries. So the goal is to ensure that you have this continuous support of the public in that country for your foreign policy goals. What are some of the key levels of public diplomacy. According to Nye, again, one of the most prominent scholars who have done a lot of research on public diplomacy, there are three levels of public diplomacy. So the first level of public diplomacy is daily communication with the press, aimed at explaining decisions made on the domestic and international level. So this is, for instance, when our president has a press conference and then explains what are the reasons that the United States imposed sanctions on Russia, or what is the current position of the United States on the war in Gaza. So these are the things that are being explained at the press conference, and this represents the first level of public diplomacy. How is this public diplomacy? Well, basically at the press conference, when the president delivers some information, the information is directed to the public. So what happens when it comes to traditional diplomacy is they meet one-on-one, they have a conversation, and then certain information from that conversation comes to us and we learn about it. But when it comes to public diplomacy, they're directing these messages to others, to a wider population, and then not just the citizens of the US, but also foreigners can learn about the position of the US. And that is how they communicate these messages to the public abroad, not just to us domestically. The second form, or the second level of public diplomacy, is strategic communication. That includes public relations and advertising. Some countries, for example, advertise in mainstream news media, such as the BBC and the CNN, in order to attract investors or tourists. Hosting international sports competitions or music competition also contributes to public diplomacy. So we'll give you some examples. I remember seeing on CNN certain ads about a vacation in Croatia, and actually Croatia, after the dissolution of former Yugoslavia, Croatia wanted to build its image as an independent country, and they started attracting a lot of tourists, and one of the ways to do that was through the ads that they had, they advertised their country on these global cable networks such as CNN. International sports competition, another example, and also music competitions. So in Europe, that is why a lot of countries are really eager to see who's going to win the Eurovision competition, because the country that wins the competition is the country that's going to host the event the year after. And you see how this is important to them, because it attracts a lot of internationals, it attracts tourists, and then it helps the country build this image of a safe place, a friendly place, like a hospitable environment, and so on. And the third level of public diplomacy are scholarships, cultural exchange, conferences, and other means to establish long-term trust between nations. So you see, these are all events that we look forward to, that we like to attend, and the events itself are positive in a way, and they really help build the bond between cultures, especially conferences. Going to a conference means you're sharing your idea, or you're exposed to other people's idea in the field that you're interested in. I also gave you an example of I gave you my own example, and you see from that example how it contributes. Actually, it helped me understand this country, and then later I moved here. But you can see it really affected my direct experience with the United States, really affected my perspective on the country. The perspective has changed in so many ways, because now I understand the culture so much better than I did before moving here. Scholarships as well, so just having international students who gain experience in the United States, who get exposed to the US educational system and then go back to their country to share that knowledge. And they basically share the knowledge that they gained in the United States and the skills in their community, which also helps in spreading the values or certain business models that we are adopting in the United States, then they spread them abroad, which is important to us, especially when we want to do international business. It really is relevant. Now, we talked about public diplomacy. Maybe you think, isn't this propaganda? If we're talking about government to public communication, we're talking about government to citizen communication instead of government to government. Isn't this a form of propaganda? Public diplomacy might look like propaganda, but it actually is not. Propaganda is different. So propaganda represents a form of communication in which a group has near or total control over the transmission of information. So there is a control, and we were able to see historical examples such as Hitler's Germany and the propaganda that he was spreading, the propaganda being spread by the North Korean government, or propaganda is now being spread during this war in Ukraine. Another thing is that public diplomacy does have these positive goals in mind. Maybe some people may perceive it abroad as a form of pressure to adopt values from the United States or from some European countries, but basically it has positive goals. The problem is only that not all the countries in the world have the same tools to implement their public diplomacy goals. Developed countries, of course, have more tools, but propaganda is deceptive. It is different. It presents only one side of the story while intentionally hiding the opposite position. Another difference between propaganda and public diplomacy is that propaganda relies on media. So propaganda has to rely on mass media. But when it comes to public diplomacy, they can rely on different forms of communication. So one form of communication, as I mentioned, bring athletes to the United States, bring students, bring journalists, expose them to this system, educational, cultural system, make them interact with others inside the country, and then let them go back to their countries and spread ideas about the US. So that is the difference. So it doesn't need to, public diplomacy doesn't necessarily need media, while on the other hand, propaganda does. Media and public diplomacy. So what is the role of the media in public diplomacy? When building a reputation and promoting their policies, governments heavily rely on news media because they can reach millions using this tool of communication. So the president needs the CNN at their press conference when they have something important to say about certain foreign policy goals. Because other people outside of the US will be able to learn about what the president had to say through CNN, BBC, or digital news websites. Once, for example, aiming at transmitting messages to foreign audiences during World War II, the federal government of the US established the Voice of America, which delivered the news in 27 languages. The Voice of America is a news organization that still exists. I was actually connected with them when I was in that professional development year program. So I arrived in Washington, D.C., and I visited Voice of America because they were assisting us in the entire process before I left for Bradley University. So in addition to this, during the Cold War, the period when public diplomacy reached its peak, Western governments and Western organizations established broadcast networks to reach out to the foreigners of the Eastern Bloc countries, foreigners that were influenced by Russia during the Cold War. So they wanted to reach out to these population because they needed it, because otherwise they were just exposed to their countries and Russian propaganda at the time. Some of the examples of establishing these independent, but actually they were Western supported media organizations include Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. So through these radio stations, people from the Eastern Bloc were able to receive different type of information, different from the information they were exposed to on a daily basis. Let's take a look at why. So as I mentioned, like public diplomacy is not just, does not only rely on media, but media do play an important role in implementing public diplomacy goals, in reaching public diplomacy goals. So they can serve as a channel for transmitting favorable framings of a country's policies and culture to the public. Also, aside from local media outlets, the forces of foreign news organizations are also being employed to promote the country's policy goals and securing support from the foreign public. Another form of impact of media is that once you employ foreign media in spreading positive frames, that means that you're likely to be successful. It is essential for the success of public diplomacy. One such example is when some Eastern European countries decided to join the European Union, their politicians started publishing articles in British newspapers prior to joining the European Union because they really needed support from the citizens of other European Union countries for their EU-related aspirations. So this is the reason why they used in their public diplomacy goals, they used foreign media. They needed foreign media to spread, to publish these favorable images of their countries. Let's take a look at US activities in public diplomacy. Maybe you're familiar with this agency. Maybe this is the first time that you hear about it, but United States Information Agency was working closely with the State Department. This agency was formed after the Second World War in 1953, but it was abolished in 1999. So you see that it was basically operating during the Cold War, and it was the focus was to spread the word about the U.S. foreign diplomacy goals. Also, the Voice of America started broadcasting in so many languages in 1942. This organization still exists, and they have they deliver news in diverse languages. Both organizations, the United States Information Agency and Voice of America, suffered an identity crisis. So it was the question whether they were objective news and cultural organizations reflecting the diversity of American life and culture, or were they just arms of the State Department advocating US policy objectives? So how do you distinguish between these two? Are you really just trying to reflect the diversity of the American life and educate other people abroad about it? Or are you just an extended arm of the US State Department, basically spreading their propaganda to other countries? In 1993, the US established International Broadcasting Bureau, and this organization was formed to oversee the operation of multiple media organizations. So they include Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and so on. Now, when we talk about media, so media has an important impact on public diplomacy. It is an important component to achieve public diplomacy goals. But what are some issues when it comes to news media? So first of all, and this especially applies to the US and European countries where media are independent, media do not necessarily spread positive images of a country, because we learn about American journalism. Our goal is to deliver the truth, provide accurate information, be independent from those we cover, being independent from those in power, to make sure that we're criticizing the government, that we're keeping them in control, that we're playing the watchdog role. So when we do all of this, we are not really portraying reality in this embellished way. We were not embellishing reality. We're basically trying to be realistic and to point at the country's problems. So because as the government doesn't have control over all the media, but only those that owns, they cannot really impact what kind of stories they're going to publish and what kind of tone they're going to use in publishing these stories. In addition to that, not all the media have the impact on the foreign public in spreading messages that contribute to public diplomacy efforts, because foreigners abroad, they're familiar with these top news organizations, so not all the media can actually have a great impact on the public abroad. For example, mainstream media such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they have a much greater impact on public opinion than local and other non-mainstream media. But remember, these news organizations are independent, so they're not going to do what the government tells them to do. They're just going to publish independent report about the US. There is a change that happened with respect to public diplomacy in the 21st century that I must reflect on. So I explained what is the role of the media in public diplomacy, and to what extent can a government or foreign country or our government rely on the media to achieve its public diplomacy goals. But traditional public diplomacy that was in place during the Second World War and right after the Second World during the Second World War, during the Cold War, and right after the Cold War, before the emergence of the internet, it basically presented a one-way process. So it was reflected in transmitting messages from the communicator to the recipients without the listening back part. So this is a one-way communication. So we have something to deliver to you, this message to the foreign public, and it's a one-way communication. But what has changed in the meantime is that with the growth of the internet and introduction of Web 2.0, which allowed this two-way communication to happen, public diplomacy has suffered certain modifications because the focus of public diplomacy has shifted from the one-way communication to the two-way communication. This form of communication affected the heart of public diplomacy because its focus has shifted from nation branding to employing communication tools for the relationship and trust building between nations and cultures. So it's kind of evolved from, oh, this is how we want people to perceive our country abroad so we can win their affection to achieve our goals. So it evolved from that into, okay, let's use this tool, communicate directly with the people abroad through social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and make sure that through this direct communication, we build trust with them. So this is how public diplomacy evolved in the Web 2.0 environment. And let's overview this lecture about public diplomacy and propaganda. Public diplomacy represents communication from government to people, so it is different from traditional diplomacy that basically is focused on government to government communication. So this is government to people. Public diplomacy is different from propaganda because it is not based on deception. Also, propaganda needs to use mass media to spread information. Public diplomacy doesn't necessarily need to do that because public diplomacy can focus on diverse groups, and basically the government can communicate with opinion leaders in another country, students, non-governmental organizations, and so on. So there are many ways to influence people in other countries, and it doesn't necessarily need to be through mass media. What is the goal of public diplomacy? Basically, to influence opinions of foreigners abroad, but also within the country. And remember that public diplomacy targets various groups and communities. We also call this form of power soft power. So this is not a policy of sticks and carrots. So we're not threatening that we're going to do something if people in another country don't comply, but we are using soft power. So we are branding our nation, we're communicating with the people abroad to ensure that we are building trust with them. And in today's media environment, as I mentioned, public diplomacy has evolved from nation branding to building trust with people from other countries. And this impact is now possible through social media. So this is the tool that they use to communicate with people from other countries directly. So, and at the end, I have an exercise for you. You need to read chapter 14 and then write an essay of about 250 words to 300 words. And the essay should address the following questions. What are some of the benefits of public diplomacy for the country? How does media, news media, aid to public diplomacy goals? How would you distinguish between public diplomacy and propaganda? Write an essay and then post your essay under public diplomacy in classes. These are my references for today. If you want to, you can read more about public diplomacy. Again, you can always get in touch with me via email, or you can contact me on Twitter or platform X. Thank you very much for your attention this semester. Enjoy your day, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.